thanks so much, Ian. And actually, on the contrary, my thanks are to you, to the Commission, and to the AOC for hosting this event today. Because I think, as you said, Ian, this is a really, really important time for the college and the FE sector. So it's great to be here and be part of the conversation. So I'm a journalist. I've been at the Observer for about 5 years. But before that, my history is working in policy and politics. I've worked for think tanks and charities that work with children and young people. So I guess I've been thinking about and writing about education policy for well over a decade now, sort of for the last 15 years. And I'm sure many of you will feel like this. Sometimes it feels like we have the same old debates again and again, with politicians turning out the same old phrases about how we want parity of esteem between academic and vocational education, equal parity between the university and the college sector, which is great. But quite often these terms get talked about in the political arena, and this is not a sort of party political point. I think this is true of both governments of late. Both parties of late, but we very rarely see the kind of concrete action that would actually lead to a parity of esteem. So it's really great to be part of a debate and part of the launch of a report, which actually I think sets out some really good practical steps for how we might start to make some of that a reality. And I think hopefully we will have a very good conversation about that today. This will all be very familiar territory to you, I'm sure, but I just wanted to very briefly recap what the issues are with the way that we do post-16 and tertiary education in this country, because I think although there's some stuff we really get right as a country, there is also a lot of stuff that could be improved upon. And, you know, that's all stuff that Ian's already touched on, but we've got this sort of, we've for a very long time had this emphasis that going to university is the best or even really the only way to continue your education after finishing school. And we've also got this sort of twin emphasis on the idea that continuing your education is kind of like a one-shot chance. You're either in it and you do it at the right time, or you kind of miss the boat. And I think so many aspects of our post-16 education system are just designed around these two principles that have kind of more been smuggled in as a result of path dependency, rather than anyone at one point just sit down and think, yes, this is how I think our education system would work. So first of all, I just want to say on the university point, and I think a common misperception in England is that since we've had tuition fees of over £9,000 a year introduced, you know, young people are sort of on their own after age 18, and they pick up the tab themselves, and there aren't sort of deep inequities in that sense between young people who go to university and young people who pursue other routes for their learning. And actually, I think that's a bit of a myth that needs blowing out of the water. Tuition fees or no tuition fees, because of the way the system works, the state still ends up subsidising the education of young people who go to university to the tune, you know, average tune of well over £20,000. Now, of course, there's no problem with that. That's, you know, a good thing. We want to be investing in our young people. But it is very, very striking when you set that against the levels of investment in young people who don't go to university. We spend very little on young people who don't go to university as a rule in general, compared to young people who go to university. And, you know, I've been writing about this gap for the last few years. To me, it's absolutely outrageous that we hugely invest in young people who go to university, and we do so little for young people who don't go, and students who don't go to university. And I just think that we should take a step back and imagine what the reaction would be if we did that pre-16. Can you imagine if we sorted our pre-16-year-olds by academic ability, which we often know functions, the way we measure academic ability often functions as a bit of a proxy for social class, and invest hugely more into 10-year-olds who've already had a head start in life? We would be outraged, quite rightly. I think we should feel the same level of outrage that those inequalities exist in the post-16 education system. And then I think we also have this very weird linear concept of learning in this country, where there is just this assumption that you do it all before you start working, which is completely bonkers in my view. I'm sure lots of people have had this experience, but some of the learning that I've done after entering the labour market full-time and leaving full-time education has been the most profoundly important to me. Lots of people are in that situation, yet we kind of still have this sort of perception, and as a result, it's kind of the way our system works, which is that if you don't do it in this order, kind of doesn't count, or you kind of haven't been successful in some way. So I think it's really, I think that's my sort of broad brush characterization of some of the issues in the system. I think those issues are related to some big problems for us as a country. I think I've already said there are massive inequalities in the opportunities that we offer young people and adults, but that is it just cannot be said enough, in my view. I think it's related to low levels of productivity in the UK that we spend ages talking about, particularly outside of London. We know there are big skills gaps that can't just be filled by undergraduate degrees in the university sector alone. Obviously, they're an important part, but they're not the whole solution. And I think the way we do post-16 education is also related to the fact that we have such a large low pay, low skill, in inverted commas, sector in the UK. There are just too many jobs out there that are deemed to be low skill. Actually, some of them are incredibly skilled. If you look at care work, for example, caring for people with advanced dementia, incredibly skilled work. It's just that some of the skills that are involved are skills that we think of as feminine skills like care and communication. So I think, you know, we've got that issue in our labour market where we have this conception of what low skill work is, which is wrong, and we don't give people the opportunity in what we deem low skill work to advance and to improve their skills. And as Ian's already said, there are just way too few opportunities for people to retrain or reskill or switch career, even as our economy is undergoing some massive transformations. And the result of that is, if you are middle class, if you've got resources, if you can afford to retrain and switch, might be tough, but you can do it. But if you are stuck in low paid work, you just do not have the money to pay to send yourself to a training course to retrain up front. So I think that, you know, that there are these whole sets of issues in the system, and I think they've all become a lot more urgent in the context of a global pandemic that has triggered a deep recession and is accentuating inequalities. And I'm sure lots of you will feel the same way, but it feels really horrible to watch what's going on right now, because it feels like economically and socially we're watching the beginnings of a replay of the 1980s all over again in slow motion. We know the ending of this story, and yet no one is taking the action needed to create a different ending, which is entirely within our grasp. And I think that there are going to be profound implications of the pandemic and the way that it is being managed for the North-South divide. I think some areas of the country are going to be much harder hit in terms of job losses than others. I think we know job losses are going to be large scale, and they are disproportionately going to impact on young people as well. And I think despite being 8 months into this pandemic, for me, this is a government that has done very, very little thinking about how to deal with the long-term consequences of this pandemic. And I think there's a huge difference in the quality of the response if you look at the very, very short-term emergency measures, like the building of the Nightingale hospitals, the furlough scheme. Obviously, some of the short-term stuff has been dreadful as well, like track and trace. But you know, when you look at the sort of long-term efforts and the long-term response, it's really, really underwhelming, whether it's the provision for children who are out of school for months. You know, why weren't structured activities put on over the summer, for example? Whether it is just the lack of thought that's gone into young people in youth and employment, and the completely underwhelming response from government on that. It just does not meet the scale of the task, as Gordon Brown has written for us at The Observer. And there's also just been too little thought. I mean, we've had some stuff from government on reskilling or retraining, but there really is no sense of urgency there. And there's no sense of ambition, I think, for the long term. So, you know, we've all watched this film before. We know what happens. We know that young people are going to be hardest hit. We know that they will experience the impacts of a poor start in the labour market for the rest of their careers, for the rest of their working lives. we know that when you lose your job and you go on to benefits and there aren't jobs there immediately and unemployment benefits are incredibly low, you know, next April after universal credit, £20 a week boost is taken away, they will be at the lowest level that they've been since 1990. We know how this story goes. It traps families into multi-generational poverty and worklessness. And if you're living on very low benefits, when you've lost your job, when you're thinking about how to keep your home, your car, how to keep your sanity, how to keep the show on the road, you are really not in a position to be thinking about retraining and reskilling and what jobs may be there for you later down the line. And if you're a child living in that household where your mum and dad are struggling to put food on the table, that's going to affect your education. So I really think that there is a lack of thinking here about the long term and what you do, and that's where I think this report comes in. And there's a couple of really important ideas in there that I hope the government will take up. I love the idea of a statutory right to lifelong learning and a skills guarantee for a post-COVID economy. I think both of those things would go some way to address some of the issues that I've been talking about. But I also think if we're really serious about parity of esteem between the college sector and the university sector, between vocational and educational academic routes rather, excuse me, I do think there are just certain things you've got to have, like parity of funding, as I've already talked about. All young people should get the same thing post 18, and adults should have access to a lifelong pot of money for their learning. But I also think actually we have to take a big step back and think about the way that our university system and higher education is structured, because one of the reasons why we have this very elitist view of post-16 education in this country is a lot to do with the way that the university system is structured because of path dependency. And I've written about this recently. We have this incredibly academically stratified university system where literally if you get AAA or BBB, that determines which university you go to. You know, it can determine the future course of your life. And it's all based on this kind of rather strange idea that young people who get AAA and BBB in their A-levels or BBB and CCC shouldn't be learning alongside each other. And I'm not quite sure that that assumption stands up or that it's a valid one. And yet it does create an education system, I think, which perpetuates privilege, inequality, because we know that A-level results are so much a reflection of social background as well as kind of innate ability. So I think we need to ask some tough questions about that system, and I certainly don't have all the answers, but I think unless we ask some questions about the system that, you know, nearly half of 18-year-olds go into and why it is so stratified, we're not going to tackle some of these broader parity of esteem issues that exist more broadly in the post-16 education system. So hopefully that is some food for thought and discussion there.
Sonia,